It was never supposed to be the storm of the decade. When in late September an atmospheric disturbance became a tropical storm, and that tropical storm became Hurricane Helen, it was thought to be just another chapter in what had been a pedestrian storm season in the Gulf of Mexico. Hurricanes are common there, they're expected, and while they're never to be taken lightly, they are a natural force that the nations of this part of the world understand how to manage. It was a significant storm, and a few hours before it made landfall, it grew into a major storm. But they could take it. Fast forward a week, and the sheer devastation that Hurricane Helen delivered to the United States has exceeded every forecast. Hundreds are confirmed dead, while hundreds more are missing. On the scale of American hurricanes, Helen is already the deadliest to impact US territory since Hurricane Maria, and the deadliest to impact America's 48 contiguous states since Hurricane Katrina. It traveled further than nearly anybody had expected, devastated communities that had thought they couldn't be hit, and brought a significant portion of America's southeast to its knees. But alongside the death and devastation, Hurricane Helen brought a warning sign. Storms, and particularly America's very biggest storms, are changing, and America is not ready. So in this special episode of Mega Projects, we're going to be closely examining Hurricane Helen, the storm itself, the devastation it wrought, and what that devastation reveals about the places it impacted most. And we'll be exploring Helen in context to one of the most major and most critical mega projects of all, how people formulate and execute responses to tremendously powerful natural disasters at a moment when those disasters come more frequently than ever. Alright, picture this, you've got a brilliant idea and it's time to get it out there, but how do you make sure that your website doesn't look like it's from 1999 or something? Well, that's where today's sponsor, Squarespace, comes in. Squarespace is the all-in-one platform for anyone looking to stand out online, whether you're launching your first site or growing your empire. First up, design intelligence. It's like having a team of designers right at your fingertips, but way easier on the budget. It uses AI to help you create a website that's not just beautiful, but tailored to your brand's vibe. You just plug in your content and voila, you've got a site that looks like you spent months on it when really it was like basically an afternoon. And if you're thinking about selling something, anything, Squarespace Payments has got you covered. It's super simple to set up and it lets your customers pay with all the popular options from Apple Pay to Afterpay. And the best part, everything is in one place so you can keep track of sales without juggling multiple tools. And don't forget their email campaign feature. You can set up automated emails that keep your audience engaged, perfect for driving sales and traffic while you focus on what matters most. So if you're ready to take your website to the next level, go to squarespace.com/megaprojects for a free trial. And when you're ready to launch, use the code MEGAPROJECTS to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or a domain. Thank you to Squarespace for sponsoring, and now back to it. The storm that would become Hurricane Helen started out the same way that every eventual hurricane does, as a low-pressure zone in the moisture of the tropical Gulf of Mexico. Those low-pressure zones, slowly moving westward, will interact with the ocean air, churning and sending cool, humid air upward to form rain clouds and then thunderstorms. As those storms grow, they rotate around their center and the winds accelerate. The storm, it's become a hurricane. In order to even be called a hurricane at all, even a weak storm will sustain winds of 74 miles per hour, that's 119 kilometers per hour at a minimum. A medium-strength storm's winds will exceed 111 miles an hour or 178 kilometers per hour. The strongest, known in America as a Category 5, will sustain winds of 157 miles per hour or 252 kilometers per hour at a minimum, and there's no upper limit. The sheer energy contained in this sort of storm is nearly incomprehensible. But we'll at least try and explain it. If all the energy of a single hurricane's winds were harnessed with perfect efficiency, then that storm could match half of the power generating capacity of all the human infrastructure on planet Earth. By the time then Tropical Storm Helen caught the world's attention in the last week of September 2024, it was well on its way to becoming a hurricane. But even in Helen's early days, there were subtle indicators that the storm had the potential to be especially bad. At the time that Helen was forming, the waters of the Gulf were at completely unprecedented temperatures. Quoting atmospheric scientist Brian McNulty here, this is pretty amazing. The ocean heat content averaged over the Gulf of Mexico is obliterating previous all-time record highs. It's 126% of average for the date. The quote ends. In some parts of the Gulf, the surface of the seas was up to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. That's nearly 32 degrees Celsius. And not only that, but it would travel over an extremely warm area of the Caribbean known as the loop currents, injecting the storm with a further boost of energy even as the surrounding winds in the area were nearly non-existent. Now, in ideal conditions, those surrounding winds would have dampened a growing hurricane, but Helen had a clear path to get stronger practically unopposed. Now, predicting a hurricane is a notoriously risky business, and that's largely because of environmental and weather factors that make modeling a hurricane's path and its power very difficult. In fact, the initial expectations around Helen were far from what would ultimately happen, with the worst of the damage predicted before the storm made landfall across the states of Florida and Georgia. It already lashed Cuba, Mexico, near the city of Cancun, and the Cayman Islands, indicating that worse was almost certainly on the way. In the stretch of open sea between Cuba and Florida, Helen was expected to rapidly intensify into a Category 3 hurricane with winds of around 120 miles per hour, 193 kilometers per hour. Even despite communities in Florida, especially the coastline, building their homes and businesses in a way that hardens them to hurricanes, such winds would still be enough to cause major damage, uproot trees, and knock out electricity and water for several days in the hardest hit areas. The storm was expected to do its worst in Florida's Big Bend area and impact the cities of Tallahassee, population 200,000, and Tampa, population 400,000. All in all, millions of people were thought to be in its path, but once the storm made landfall, it was expected to do what all hurricanes do on land: rapidly drop in intensity, returning to tropical storm levels within a couple of hundred miles at most, and eventually peter out and scatter into rain showers. But in the hours before Helen arrived, it continued to intensify, eventually turning into a Category 4 hurricane with sustained winds of 140 miles per hour or 225 kilometers per hour. It crashed into the town of Perry, Florida at just past 11 at night on Thursday, September the 26th, and then roared inland for a bit before turning northward. The storm's projected path had already been expected to take it up through the state of Georgia, then to the Appalachian mountain range that runs up and down America's east into communities in the states of North and South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, and Kentucky. But now, the added energy rolling within the storm promised two tightly interrelated and very dangerous developments. Now the storm was going to reach further inland, and when it did, it would lash the land with high winds and dump rain characteristic of a hurricane or major tropical storm. Not only that, but the storm had changed in other ways. Its rain clouds were far larger and more expansive than expected, meaning that as the slow-moving storm passed over any given place in its path, that place would have to weather extreme rainfall for far longer than previously believed. If any square foot of land might otherwise have expected, say, 6 inches of rain, it would now get 12 or even 18. In Florida, Helen would bring a devastating storm surge all across coastal areas, meaning not just high waves, but a swell of the entire sea, some 8 feet higher than its usual levels. It was the worst hurricane hit to the Tampa Bay area of Florida in over 100 years. Elsewhere in the state, the popular restaurant chain Waffle House would close down numerous locations, in a silly sounding but actually very useful metric to indicate just how bad the damage in those areas would be. In Georgia, over 11 inches or 28 centimeters of rain crashed down on the state capital of Atlanta, the highest 2-day rain total ever observed there since a record-keeping began back in 1878. That water, not just in Atlanta, would flow into rivers and streams, swelling them to unprecedented crests in Georgia, North and South Carolina, Virginia, and Tennessee. Many of the rivers would flood to levels that eclipsed even the biggest historical floods on record. In one community in South Carolina, rain totals would hit nearly 22 inches or 55 centimeters, while large numbers of communities would receive rainfall far beyond anything in living memory. The storm would spawn dozens upon dozens of tornadoes, some of which devastated neighborhoods to a level even beyond what the hurricane winds would achieve on their own. From Helen's winds, trees were ripped out from the ground and toppled. From Helen's rains, massive landslides cascaded unpredictably and sometimes fatally. By the time the storm finally dissipated on September the 29th, the land it had traveled over was utterly devastated. In aggregate numbers, the sheer impact of Hurricane Helen is unlike any weather event the United States has endured in this decade. It is the most damaging storm to hit the US mainland since Hurricane Katrina in 2005. At the time of writing, the death toll sits at 227, including 113 from the state of North Carolina, 48 from South Carolina, 33 from Georgia, and another 33 between Florida, Tennessee, and Virginia. That death toll is almost certain to rise, and when it does, the names that must be added to the list will likely be removed from another one, the list of missing. At present, official sources place the number of missing at roughly 200 to 300, but there's reason to think that many more could be out there. Community-run lists of missing persons maintained by private citizens in the wake of the disaster list over 1,400 names still missing at the time of writing. A high proportion of the missing may have been swept away by floodwaters, and the hope of finding survivors is quickly diminishing. If all 1,400 missing truly are dead, then the death toll from Helen would eclipse that of even Hurricane Katrina, standing at over 1,620, beyond Katrina's 1,392. For the sake of comparison, 135 people are still officially listed as missing in Katrina's wake. When it comes to material damages, that count still rises too. Current estimates tally damage at a value of nearly $40 billion, but these figures are listed at a time when many areas still have yet to be closely assessed. Total economic losses, according to the Fiscal Times, may ultimately crest over $250 billion. But the numbers, by themselves, don't tell the whole story, and although we won't be going through an exhaustive list of the dead, the missing, and the accounts of survivors, we will shine a spotlight on just a few. In Florida, for example, the areas where Hurricane Helen hit hardest would weather levels of damage that they haven't seen in a generation. After all, this is Florida, a place that's well hardened to hurricanes like this, yet in this case, it wasn't enough. In the Tampa Bay area, over 1,000 people had to be rescued from the rushing storm surge after declining to evacuate. One local sheriff's office requested the people who chose not to leave would write their personal details on their bodies in permanent marker to help authorities identify their corpses. The island community of Cedar Key was described by one resident as being, quote, completely gone. In the state of Georgia, the local meteorologist named Bob Van Dillen would rescue a woman from a partially submerged car on live television. Elsewhere across the state, flooding devastated many neighborhoods and left large numbers of roads entirely impassable. Well over a dozen deaths in the state would come after people were crushed or trapped by falling trees. Georgia's poultry industry, supplying nearly half of all chickens consumed annually in the US, was devastated in an economic blow that will be felt across America for months. In North Carolina, the city of Asheville was inundated with incredible flooding, entirely washing out multiple districts of the city, while access to the city was cut off on multiple interstates due to landslides. Elsewhere in the state, a long section of interstate highway was washed away, and numerous smaller towns were hit very, very hard by the flooding. The town of Spruce Pine was nearly wiped out, posing a major threat to global supply chains because of Spruce Pine's sole U.S. source of ultra-high purity quartz, essential in semiconductors. Elsewhere in the state, a factory that supplies intravenous fluids to much of America was flooded and forced to shut down. The vast majority of one community, Chimney Rock, was either completely destroyed or heavily damaged by the swell of the nearby Broad River. In South Carolina, some 1.3 million people lost power, including several parts of the state that lost power completely. Tennessee's helicopter crews would log 58 rescues from flood conditions, including in the town of Irwin, where a medical hospital was submerged completely. There, numerous bridges collapsed and several more interstate highways sustained heavy damage. Finally, in the state of Virginia, 70 more water rescues had to take place, while more minor damage was reported in the states of West Virginia, Illinois, Kentucky, and Ohio. We describe the impact of Hurricane Helen in such state-by-state detail, partly for the simple reason that it's important to do so. Helen, like any major destructive weather event around the world, didn't just capture headlines, it changed millions of lives, and in at least several hundred cases it ended them. But we also describe the scope and scale of the damage because as we turn our attention to both what went right and what went wrong in the aftermath, it's important to remember that this was a massive natural disaster. What Hurricane Helen was and what it did was entirely outside the control of any person, any community, or any government, and by a long shot. But that same reality is what makes a careful, competent, and most of all, effective emergency response so important. People can't control what the weather will do, but people can control how they respond. And it's the burden, not just of federal disaster management agencies, but state and local governments, community leaders, and any other person with the power to save or accidentally end the lives of others to both plan for such a response and execute when the time comes. To that end, we'll start on the positive side, because as has been the case with so many disaster management efforts in recent history, there are many elements to the response that should be regarded as a success. Across the American Southeast, very few hospitals ever had to close down entirely despite blackouts, flooding, and more. Power and water infrastructure repair personnel were on hand, ready to surge into hard-hit areas in massive numbers, and they did exactly that. The country's Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, has thus far distributed some $344 million to survivors of the storm, provided 17.2 million meals, and supplied 13.9 million liters of water as of October the 9th. Over 3,200 people received direct assistance from search and rescue teams, and well over $100 million has been funneled to efforts to restore critical transportation infrastructure. Every state that has been impacted by Helen has been engaged in its own relief efforts. Furthermore, countless individuals took heroic action to save the lives of others over the course of Helen's destruction. In the hurricane's wake, communities are banding together everywhere. Quoting a one Associated Press article here about the town of Black Mountain, North Carolina, alongside a fence row, a makeshift message board listed the names of people still missing. In other areas, mules delivered medical supplies to mountaintop homes. Residents collected water from creeks and cooked over camp stoves. And across the region, people were looking after each other. The quote ends. In just about every catastrophe in history, people respond by banding together, whether because of their work in an official capacity or simply human decency and care for others, and Helen was no different. But despite many reasons for hope, Hurricane Helen revealed everything from neglected elements of American infrastructure to failures and oversights in planning to clear insufficiencies in emergency response protocol. Of all the individual items to talk about, however, perhaps none present the contrast so starkly as the missing list. A present official counts of the missing, aggregated among the various states, put the total number in the 270 to 300 range. Private citizens, however, have put together a different list, and it's substantially longer, with the discrepancy between official and community reports of missing being multiple hundreds of persons who are apparently not accounted for on official lists. The community lists are constantly updated with news of people who've been found, alive or deceased, but the names on the community lists don't appear to make it onto official ones, constituting a massive barrier to either finding any survivors who could still remain or notifying loved ones of the fate of a missing person. Also high on the list of devastating hits to the American southeast was damage to critical transportation infrastructure across the region. One key interstate, the I-40, is expected to be shut down for multiple months after a large part of the interstate washed out. The I-26 will be shut down for months too, with a combination of washouts making it difficult for people to navigate between North Carolina and Tennessee at all. Numerous state highways suffered severe damage and will be closed for repairs for the foreseeable future. Several key bridges have washed out due to floodwaters or have collapsed due to erosion or where they were supported on riverbanks. Hundreds upon hundreds of roads across the region are shut down, many of which would take weeks to rebuild at the best of times, let alone when they'll be weighed as a priority against all the other roads that have to be put back together. Now, there's simply no timeline for getting a lot of them fixed, no matter how badly local residents may need them working. After the roads, there were the dams, where thankfully the news during and after Helen was not nearly as bad as it could have been. Despite several incidents of dams overflowing and widespread fears of catastrophic failures that could have killed hundreds or even thousands of people, most dams in the affected areas managed to hold, but only barely. In the state of Tennessee, evacuation orders were issued in the city of Newport after reports of a catastrophic failure of a dam upstream. Luckily, the reports were identified as a false alarm. In North Carolina's Rutherford County, the Lake Lure Dam was observed with floodwater overflowing its 120-foot-high crest and flowing uncontrolled around its sidewalls, causing authorities to urge locals to flee to high ground. The Lake Lure Dam was identified to be in only fair condition even before Helen hit, and the fact that it held was little more than luck. Another dam in eastern Tennessee was found to be on the brink of imminent failure during the storm, and many across the region had to have all their floodgates opened at once, venting out as much water as was physically possible to reduce the strain. Make no mistake, the lack of dam collapses is a very good thing, but it's nothing short of a dodged bullet. And with so much infrastructure destroyed, emergency organizations have been unable to reach some of the hardest hit communities by standard means, only to realize that they have very few alternative solutions. Airdrops by helicopter into affected areas are possible, and they've delivered some of the most critical supplies, including food, medicine, and limited amounts of water. But the rest has had to come by way of private citizens doing what they can to help. Some of those private citizens come by way of their own helicopters, dropping off whatever supplies the choppers can carry. Others have had to use large numbers of pack mules, driving their mules through devastated communities and broken landscapes in order to deliver whatever the animals can bear on their backs. The communities devastated by Helena Mountain are sometimes remote and accessible by only a few scarce roads, which often followed the same low paths that would be a conduit for water to move in flash floods. The process for private citizens to intervene hasn't run smoothly either. In one instance in North Carolina, a helicopter pilot attempting to rescue desperate people in an isolated community was threatened with arrest and ordered to stop his rescue efforts. Other accounts indicate he may have been far from the only one. Then there was Helen's effect on those less fortunate, particularly prisoners who were in correctional institutions at the time Helen roared through. In one prison in North Carolina, inmates were never evacuated and had to live for 5 days without running water or lights while confined to their cells with only minimal interaction with prison personnel. In Florida, a jail located in the storm's path was not evacuated, despite evacuation orders for the entire surrounding community. Nor was this the only instance in which prisoners became more involved with the hurricane than they might have hoped. In Florida, low-risk prisoners were brought en masse to help deal with post-storm debris in a form of prison labor. Unfortunately, Helen was further complicated by efforts within the United States to turn it into a political issue. It's no secret that the US is now less than a month away from a major election, and despite the imminent risk of harm to people who don't have the information they need, misinformation has spread like wildfire. One US congressperson claimed on social media that an unspecified they were controlling the weather to cause Hurricane Helen, while numerous officials and leaders within America's right-leaning Republican Party have claimed either outright or by strongly implying that disaster relief may come slower to the areas hit by Helen because those areas tend to vote Republican rather than for the Democrats who control the presidency and thus the executive authority for emergency response. FEMA has had to launch an entire rumor response webpage to deal with the onslaught of outright misinformation, debunking claims that FEMA lacks the money to assist with Hurricane Helen, that it was turning away volunteers, and that it was asking for donations in cash. At the same time, FEMA attempted to explain elements of its disaster response that have been misconstrued and even co-opted online. And then there's the matter of simple human error, or some might say acts of blatant human stupidity. In one such case, a factory called Impact Plastics is now under investigation in Tennessee after several people were killed and more were declared missing after being trapped there. Those workers, according to their relatives and other survivors, were made to show up for work regardless of the incoming hurricane, and they allege that they or their relatives were denied the opportunity to leave until it was too late. When they finally got permission to go, floodwaters had already inundated the parking lot with so much water that escape was impossible. The company, at least thus far, has attempted to direct blame elsewhere. In another instance, the town of Clemson, South Carolina, was devastated by Helen, with power and water infrastructure knocked out and gas scarce, but that didn't stop Clemson University from hosting 80,000 out-of-towners for a college game of American football, placing immense strain on the community. And finally, there's an element to the Helen response that simply comes down to a fundamental lack of readiness for disasters this big. Federally, FEMA has long tried to draw attention to its dwindling funds. As FEMA Administrator Deanne Criswell described in a National Public Radio interview after Helen, quote, "We are running low in our disaster relief funds, and we went into what we call immediate needs funding in early August." Per Criswell, that regulatory change allowed FEMA to divert funds to urgent life-saving work, but it is a band-aid solution that can only keep up for a few months. Said America's Secretary of Homeland Security Alejandro Mayorkas, quote, "We are expecting another hurricane hitting. FEMA does not have the funds to make it through the season." Individual states as well as private companies are in a similar bind. In North Carolina, for example, repair crews were entirely unable to keep up with forecasts and projections on how quickly they'd restore power to residents, largely because of the sheer extent of the damage. As one spokesperson for the company Duke Energy put it when discussing its 100,000 customers in areas with catastrophic damage, quote, "We're talking about places where the homes no longer exist." That's the sort of damage that energy companies are capable of dealing with when a river floods or a tornado devastates a town. But with an event as big as Helen, that catastrophic damage is repeated 100 times over. From power companies to road repair to food distribution and more, what Helen has revealed, most of all, is the sheer lack of capacity to deal with weather events of this size. Go town by town, and the damage that Helen caused is bad, but not unprecedented. But zoom out on the map, and the devastation is on a magnitude that these states just don't have the infrastructure to handle. So as we conclude today's special episode, we've got to turn toward the future and the major implications that Hurricane Helen brings to not just the United States, but the entire world. It's difficult to overstate just how much of a historical anomaly Helen was. After all, much of the devastation was in areas where hurricanes simply don't go. Asheville, one of the cities most thoroughly devastated by Helen, was even referred to as a haven from natural disasters in recent years, given its high elevation, cool temperatures, and distance from the sea. This part of America isn't a world away from the Gulf of Mexico, but it's certainly far enough that by the time any remnants of a hurricane get there, they should be hardly more notable than any other passing storm system. But the reality that Hurricane Helen presented was a very different one, and the results spoke volumes about what sort of emergency prep had been done in the area versus the sorts that had not. The problem wasn't so much that local, state, or federal assistance wouldn't be able to figure out how to fix the problems Helen caused, but that the scale and wide-reaching impact of such a massive disaster was previously unthinkable. In this part of the country, there's little of the appropriate infrastructure to deal with a massive hurricane because massive hurricanes aren't a historically plausible event there. At the same time, America's broader infrastructure decay was on full display. Thousands of American dams are known to be in poor condition, well over 40% of American bridges are half a century old or more, and well over a third of them are in need of repair. The condition of over half of all rural interstate pavement is described as either fair, mediocre, or poor. Any one of those problems is fixable, but take them together and they represent a broken system that simply isn't equipped to be resilient to challenge. As for the role of climate change in Hurricane Helen, the vast majority of credible scientists and experts on the matter agree that climate change was very much to blame, not for Hurricane Helen's existence, but for its intensity. Despite the cultural connotation of climate change, and particularly the phrase global warming evoking the idea that the world is simply getting hotter and hotter, the reality of the phenomenon is a bit different. The simplest way to conceptualize the way it actually works is to think in terms of energy. The issue isn't that the energy within the Earth's atmosphere is hotter or colder, it's just that there's a lot more of it. Whether an atmospheric event is a heat wave, or a blizzard, or a hurricane, or a drought, there's more energy being poured into that atmospheric event. And thus, whatever event we're referring to is going to be bigger. Droughts get longer and drier. Blizzards get more frequent and dump more snow, and tropical storms accelerate into hurricanes faster and become more powerful than they otherwise would. Helen, or a tropical storm like it, was going to be in the Gulf of Mexico around this time, even if the climate were in its pre-industrial state. But the damage of Helen, the power, the duration, and the eventual devastation of the storm almost certainly owed itself to a supercharge of energy that would not otherwise have been a factor. Of course, we do want to acknowledge that in some parts of the world, particularly the US, climate change remains a divisive issue. But we'll put it to you this way. Even if humans weren't to blame for climate change, the reality of weather observations around the world indicates that however the atmosphere got so supercharged, it is supercharged. Excuse the bluntness, but in truth, the effects of that change will care very little about the political affiliation of communities that will be devastated. In this particular case, a wealth of prior research and an ample number of expert analysts have been able to generate preliminary figures on just how much of a factor climate change was for Hurricane Helen itself. The North Atlantic Ocean, for example, is estimated to store up to 90% of the excess heat caused by climate change, supercharging atmospheric events in the area with more and more energy. According to data from non-profit organization Climate Central, the record warm waters that bred Hurricane Helen in the Gulf of Mexico were between 200 and 500 times more likely than they would have been in pre-industrial conditions. As American attention shifts from the cleanup from Hurricane Helen to the cleanup from Hurricane Milton and more, the world's attention will need to shift elsewhere too. But in dealing with these sorts of growing disasters all over the world, it's simply not enough to take the lessons learned from Helen and repeat them elsewhere. We said it a moment ago, and we'll say it again. Climate change doesn't just make everything hot. It takes whatever major weather events happen to be common in a given area, and it makes more of them, and it makes them worse. Disaster management can't be generalized, it can't be oversimplified, and it can't be done overnight, but it is absolutely critical. And the world can either put in the work now or be caught unprepared when a crisis arrives.